Welcome to the Finding Your Freedom podcast, the podcast helping high-achieving professionals thrive with freedom and purpose. I'm your host, Nat Baldwin. In each episode, we'll explore transformative journeys, practical strategies, and inspiring stories to help you create a life aligned with your true values. Whether you're seeking to optimize your current role or explore new paths, this podcast is your guide. Today I'm chatting with Stuart, whose story really dives into one of the biggest questions high-achieving professionals face. What happens when external success doesn't quite fill you internally? After decades working for big international finance firms in London and Luxembourg, Stuart found himself living what he calls an inauthentic life, successful on paper but disconnected from his true values and purpose on a personal level. What makes Stuart's journey really interesting is how life's toughest moments ended up being triggers for real change. Instead of letting tragedy, including the heartbreaking loss of his daughter Molly, define him, he turned that grief into wisdom about what really matters. His story shows how adversity can be a teacher, helping us see the difference between just getting through life and thriving. One thing I find really interesting about Stuart's story is how we might have crossed paths in totally different settings. As he shares in our chat, it's easy to imagine us meeting in a boardroom, talking about a deal, swapping business cards, and never realizing how much we might share beneath those professional masks. We could have worked side by side for years without knowing about his trips to India, his meditation practice, or his deep insights on authenticity and purpose. It's a great reminder of how much of ourselves we often leave at the door when we walk into corporate spaces. Today's talk dives into the tension between staying true to yourself and meeting corporate expectations, what it really takes to be an authentic person, and how to handle big life changes. Stuart shares real lessons on turning grief into growth, finding meaning in unexpected places, and even how he started tree hugging as part of living authentically. Thanks for that clickbaity bit at the end there, Stuart. This isn't just another story about switching careers, it's about the courage to realign your work life and your core values, even if that means starting afresh in your 50s. Stuart, thanks very much for being on the Finding Your Freedom podcast. Really appreciate your time today. Why don't we just get straight into it? Give us a brief overview of your life's journey so far, and if you could perhaps highlight some of the key moments and achievements that have shaped who you are in front of us today, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for having me, Nat. Really appreciate your time. So, I'm from Leeds, guess a pretty ordinary middle-class childhood. I was fortunate enough to go to private school and boarding school, didn't really care for school, and that was reflected in my results. I was more interested in sport and rebelling, I suppose. Then had a kind of half-hearted attempt at university, dropped out of that. Spent my early 20s, having lots of fun and, working to live really. And so that was kind of my life up to being, I think, 23. And then it really changed when I went to India for the first time and went to Varanasi, which is the holy city in India, saw Manikarnika Ghat, which is, for those who don't know, Varanasi is the holiest city in India. If you die within the walls of the old city, you go straight to heaven. So they burn the bodies by the side of the Ganges, and it's indelibly etched on my memory. It had a really lasting impact on me and that entire trip. But that particular moment just opened my eyes to, how incredible and diverse, I suppose, the world is. We then went to Nepal and started seeing this girl, and very sadly, she died in a whitewater rafting accident on the Kalikandiki, and so being in India, that happening, that was a real kind of seminal trip for me in my life. I really kind of grew up in some respects, I suppose. And I came back from that, changed, but I didn't, not too much change, if that makes sense. And, I ended up basically working in finance. I ended up in the City of London. I had a great time living in London. Super 5 years, 28 years old. And I got a call on a Sunday morning to say my dad had died literally overnight. In my age, I'm 52, he'd had a heart attack, so that was huge for the family, just working through that. And the next year spent with basically, as much as I could with my mum. And then when I was at 30, just gone 30, I was made, no, I wasn't made redundant. I left the company I was working for in London, and I tidied up my affairs in London and booked a one-way ticket to India, and then spent the next year traveling, which was amazing. Ended up working for a property development company in Thailand, which was absolutely brilliant fun. Met my ex-wife there, came back to the UK, back into finance, ended up coming to Luxembourg, which is where I live now. And we had our children. We had three children. Ella was the oldest, and then Molly was the second, and then George is the youngest. And Molly was born with mental and physical disability. So the first few years of her life were super tough, in and out of hospital all the time, intensive care, super traumatic. We didn't know what was happening. But after she got through the first few years, that happened less and less. And yeah, I mean, just it became, we didn't know what would happen in terms of Molly's kind of development, but it was just incredible. And she was a beautiful, brave child and just brought so much joy to the house. And then, yeah, sadly, 2 days after her sixth birthday, we found her dead in her room. And yeah, life changed, obviously. I think anyone who's lost a child will tell you that that's the ultimate line of the sand. And so then, yeah, I mean, just a potted history here. Obviously, my marriage ended. Put huge pressure on it, and it was then that after the marriage ended that I found therapy, or around the time it was ending, I found therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, and I had a therapeutic breakthrough quite quickly, and it really changed my world. And I'm speaking honestly, I felt a semblance of self-esteem for the first time in my life, and then it just put me on a kind of therapeutic journey, really, and that included plant medicine, ayahuasca, and that's really, moved the needle for me, I suppose, made a huge difference and changed the direction of my life in a really beautiful and profound way. And so the really these last kind of 5 years, I've been with my fiance Louise, who's the love of my life, and yeah, we're just on this beautiful journey, and got made redundant from the investment bank I was working for in November, and then just embarking on this journey to live a life of purpose and service. And here I am on your podcast.
Wow, fantastic. Thanks for that summary. And it sounds as though you've led such a rich life. And especially, I think, maybe to the purpose a little bit of this podcast, you're in sort of professional services. I'd say you're a very high achieving person, professional. You've had this corporate career, but there's also, that's just a part of your life. So I'm really interested in unpacking that, because I think certainly my experience in the corporate world is I think we talked about this before, which is we could have met in a totally different situation and talked about a deal or something, and then we never would have realized we had all these things. We've actually got quite a lot in common. I mean, I didn't realize you'd been to Varanasi. I went to Varanasi too. It's I found it quite grimy and quite tough, but that's another whole nother thing. But yeah, I'm interested in that exploring, who we are when we turn up kind of in the corporate world, and who we are, as a holistic person, if you like, without trying to use too much coaching bullshit language. But yeah, I mean, what comes up when I say that to you? What do you think of that?
Just one story, actually, which I was working for an American bank. I had a mentor, and she was a very senior lady. We'd meet for an hour a month, and I'd known her for, and we'd have coffees as well, and I'd known her for, the best part of the year. And I made a joke about, how I was having a boring weekend and that I didn't drink. And she just found it totally believable that I would be a boring teetotal person. And I just had this kind of like realization that the person that I was bringing to the office was not really a reflection of who I actually am, you know. And I think that a lot of people who are in corporate, not just corporate, but corporate especially, you have a persona. And that kind of anecdote will really resonate because, you know, I'm not who I am. And for example, nobody that I work with knew I'd done plant medicine, and that's been a huge part of my transformation and my life. And so, yeah, I think that, certainly for me in the corporate world, I wasn't really, it wasn't me turning up. It was this version of me that was there to do the job, you know, in finance, which is fine. And I suppose a lot of people would say they do the same thing. But I think for me, you know, actually reflecting on that, looking back now, I don't, it doesn't resonate. I want to be authentic in everything that I do. And I wasn't, I didn't, I wasn't, I didn't feel like I could be, you know,
Mm.
perhaps because the person I actually am isn't the person that turns up to the office, and
Mm.
there were these quite clear demarcation between the two.
That's interesting. If we were to unpack that then, because this kind of idea of authenticity comes up a lot, what was the difference between the kind of the ayahuasca home life kind of you and the guy who turned up, in the office?
Yeah, I suppose, just being, hmm, I suppose just being professional in that environment, you know, means being, there is especially in banking, and I think there are a lot of industries will probably, it would be the same. There is a way of being, right? And that there is an expectation, and the senior you get, the more this comes into play. There is an expectation of how you will behave, what you will say, what you will do. And, I think that that's an unwritten thing that, you know, you get to a certain level because you know how to behave in those kind of situations. And I think that that behavior isn't a true reflection, or didn't feel like a true reflection of me. And I said, although I say that, and I believe what I said, I also, tried to bring, some of myself to the office. I would have regular lunchtime. I'm a qualified meditation teacher and accredited meditation teacher. I would do lunchtime meditation classes, that kind of thing. And, I would go to work with the intention of being kind to everybody. And so I did what I could to kind of bring myself to the party, so to speak. But it only felt, and looking back now, only feels like a small part of really who I am.
What was the response to you bringing in these, practices like meditation? And I mean, were you overt about bringing an intention? Did you speak to people in the office about maybe some of the travels you'd been on?
Yeah, I think a couple of people who I would kind of say were friends, knew about that. But the bank that I worked for, like, most organizations these days, wellness is a big part of, you know, what they want to bring for their people. And so there was like a lot of different activities throughout the year. They had a wellness month. And I think that's what started it for me. I just got in touch with the
Mm.
people who organize it and said, look, I can teach meditation. Why don't you offer this as well? And this was right in the sweet spot of, what they were trying to do to really kind of improve well-being for the staff. And so, I got in, I kind of, that was my in really. And I kind of got in that way. And then because that actually was relatively successful, I suppose, in terms of the fact that, I think the first time 25 people, gave some of their time at lunchtime and came down, and then we just went on from there, and it was, they were always well attended.
Great. And so, just could you just expand perhaps on a little bit about where you are exactly now in your life?
Mm.
As I understand it, you're in this kind of transitional phase. Would that be
Mm.
accurate?
It is, yeah. I mean, I'm not earning any money from coaching at the moment, just laying the groundwork to be able to. So what I'm doing at the moment is I'm doing a professional certified coaching qualification through the International Coach Academy, where you and I met. I'm also doing a course in science and consciousness, after my last ayahuasca retreat, I went down a little bit of a consciousness rabbit hole. I came across this certification, and I didn't know exactly why I was doing it, but my instinct told me that that was what I had to do. And so I signed up for that as well. So I'm doing those two courses at the moment, and we can segue into instinct if you like, because that's a super powerful thing for me. But once I finish the science and consciousness course, which I will in the next kind of couple of months, I'm then thinking about, what am I going to do with that time, which is about 15 or so hours a week. And then, you know, podcasting is something that I'm super interested in. I think it's a great medium. And I'm a voracious consumer of podcasts myself, right?
You've
Um,
sent me some great ones that I've listened to over the last few weeks.
some unbelievable content, right? And just really helping to open our minds, educate us, to entertain, frankly, as well. And also, I've got a book in me as well. I hired a transformation coach last year, and the where we got to was that the thing that kind of interested me most was writing a book. So, so I think those kind of three prongs, if you like, are where I see my future at the moment. But I'm also aware that and open to the fact that something else may come up, right? I feel like I'm on the right path, the path of purpose, the path of service, the path that talks to who I am. And let's see where we go with it. But I've got the ideas and I'm taking action to move them forward. The whole concept of make a decision and make it happen, right? I've made these decisions and I'm making it happen. And then I don't know where it's going, but instinctually it kind of feels right. So that's where I'm at today. And over the next 18 months, I suppose what I would say, really looking to monetize those things to provide, a source of income for me and my family.
What made you move out of or what was important now in your life about moving out of the corporate world and banking? What allowed that to happen? I know that you said you were made redundant, but
Yeah,
I am pretty sure, having spoken to you, that you'd be able to get another job quite easily in that space. So it
yeah.
was, you can disagree with me here, but it feels like it was an intention that you had to move out of that space. I'm wondering kind of why now?
Yeah, completely. So I was made redundant 3 years ago, and I took a year out, and I just had a great time. Did a bit of traveling, and I did a diploma in nutrition, the course in meditation teaching I mentioned. But I didn't really take a future career seriously. I was honestly playing a bit, and then because I always felt like I would go back into finance, and I did. This great story of serendipity where one of my ex-bosses just ended up calling me and I ended up working for him. He's a super guy. But then when I got made redundant this time, it felt different. I felt, that this was this was my opportunity. And as something I mentioned, my instinct is driving me here, right? I'm 52 years old. I'm sure I could get a job. A few people have asked me if I want them to put my CV forward. I've politely declined. Yeah, because I feel like now is the time for me. It feels like the right time to make that transition. Um, and if I do go back into finance, I go back into finance, and you know, I have no issue with that. But what I want to be able to say is that I've at least tried to make this work. And if it doesn't, then that's how it's all going to play out, and we'll just flow with it and then see where life takes us. But yeah, I think that's it really.
So just see, sounds like you've got quite a relaxed attitude towards this transitional phase and just see how things pan out.
Well, I didn't always have a relaxed attitude, and this has been part of my journey as well, right? Um, because I was going from a corporate world to a world like this is it's huge. It couldn't be more different for me anyway. And so when I first was embarking on doing the coaching, and I was very beginning of my sense and consciousness course, I was feeling anxious. I hadn't been a beginner at anything for a long, long time, and I was projecting into the future a lot. And as I said, it was creating anxiety for me. And then I was listening to an American guy called Rich Roll, I believe you know, amazing man, his podcast, and he was talking about daily intention, right? And how you manage this by setting, manage any anxiety when you're projecting in the future by setting daily intention. And so I knew all this, but it was left behind a bit. And there was just like a little light bulb moment. And so, as I was setting an intention of going to the office and being kind, I am setting an intention every day when I'm working of making progress, of doing some reading, of furthering myself, of getting better at the things that I'm trying to be good at. And so the relaxed attitude really comes from that. Because as long as I set a daily intention of doing those things that I mentioned, then it almost feels like the rest will just all sort itself out. It may seem kind of a bit kind of laissez-faire or just completely relaxed, but my experience in life has been that if you do set these intentions, then you know you can. It's an accumulative effect, right? It's a cumulative effect. So, everything adds up over time because you've been doing it. You're turning up day after day, and the results will come.
Sounds like you've also changed your focus in life from, just effectively kind of doing the job and to focusing more, which could be seen as actually focusing more on financial, like earning money, towards an intentionality on personal growth. Is that accurate or not?
I think there is that there definitely. I think for me, this move away from finance has been simply, I think there are multiple reasons, but the biggest one is to find something purposeful, to be of service and to have purpose in my life. And I think that I feel like, that was missing for me in all those decades of working. What we were talking, you and I were talking about going on air earlier, the more you earn, the more stress and pressure you're under. And all that happens is, you just spend more money on the same things. You have a better car or a better hotel or whatever it may be. And for me, it feels like that's the compensation for the stress and the pressure, right? And so there's an element of moving away from that as well. And, building wealth through having purpose, through love and compassion and service, rather than building wealth through what for me was meaningless. And I don't mean that perhaps meaningless is the wrong word, but it didn't have purposeless, apart from to
Just didn't
provide for
match up for you at that point in time, right? Because I think
precisely.
these jobs can have purpose, can't they? I don't think we're saying they're purposeless. It's just that it's just got to match your own personal intention. But I really like this idea of the intentionality, and I really like that idea of taking the intention to the job that you did have, which was to be kind to people. But people can, I guess, this is what I'm really interested in exploring as well with people, is like that idea that you can find an intention and a beauty and a meaning in pretty much anything they're doing, or certainly more than they had been if they really set their mind to it. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely, I do. I do just want to go back, if I can, then just to kind of clarify, you know, purposeless, because clearly there is a purpose with what I did, but I mean within the context of having a purpose and serving others.
Mm.
It didn't have that type of purpose, right? Which is why,
Mm.
I termed it that, because I don't want.
Serving others in a specific way, you mean? Because you were serving others, just in a different way, I imagine, because
Yeah,
every
no,
job
that's true.
serves
That's true. And I suppose, I was helping people and doing it in a kind of respectful way. And, that is of service. It didn't feel as of service or of service enough, I suppose.
it.
I wanted it to be of more service. And, here we are, I guess. Yeah.
So so it's an interesting context. It's about the weighting, I guess, and of what we
Mm.
decide to do with our time. And it feels like you've gone, yeah, more towards that personal development and living it more just in a clear line, direct sort of service route, I guess you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're having this conversation now, and I think about, who I am, and as I've got older and I've got more in touch with more authentic self, and my foray into finance, whether it's true or not, is kind of an aside, which is that I wanted my father was senior in finance, and you know I wanted his approval, and that was so far
Mm.
away from who I am. And I went to India and I connected with that part of me, which is who I am. But I came back to the West and or to my life in the UK, and I was still living with my parents, and all that became really, really blurred. And then I'm back in finance, and then despite just having all these dips into travel and so on, and all the people that I'm friends with, it was still the job that I did was the job in finance, and it I'm in no way, being disparaging to anybody who does this, and please don't get me wrong, but it just wasn't, you know, when I look back and I think about who I am, who I would like to be, it really just wasn't for me.
Mm. One of the things I'm also really interested in is this idea that as we sort of reach midlife, mid career, we become usually, as we understand ourselves better than we perhaps do at the beginning of our
Mm,
life. And it's to a different extent for everybody. And part of my coaching, I think, is about trying to help people understand who they are to make, a decision about either finding the beauty or finding the meaning in whatever they're doing at the moment, or making a change or whatever
mm.
it might be. But I'm interested in, from your journey, if you like, what was what was it you learned about yourself? You mentioned sort of CBT, you mentioned these trips to India. What are the kind of key things that changed you in your thinking or reflections?
Yeah, I mean, so much has changed for me. I think the travel, the therapy, the plant medicine, the podcasts, the conversations with open people have really just led me to have just a much, just a really much better relationship with myself, and therefore a better relationship with everybody else. So I'm more compassionate with myself now than I ever was. I just have, I feel freer than I ever was. I just have these, what feel to me like, just through my learning, just these beautiful insights, in life, which are things like, the wisdom of the fact that, all events are neutral. It's the event isn't good or bad. It's our reaction to the event. That, you know, all our mistakes and failures, if we see them as mistakes and failures and we just look at them in isolation of something that happened on one particular day, I can appreciate how people might think that. But if you extrapolate these things over time and you look back and you can recognize the learning, the good that came, and the opportunity to grow from everything that I would call one of my failures or mistakes, you know, that's life changing. And I think that all of that experience has really, brought me to where I am today, which is that, I'm human and I don't always get it right, but that I embody those things, and I live my life according to them. And It's such a relief, you know, just to have this thing in my head, and it's like it's all okay. It's all part of the process. It's all okay. So I think there are many more probably, but I would say definitely, but they're the key ones. I reckon just that great relationship with myself, and that extends to my children and the people I love and those around me. So yeah.
Hmm. Sort of sounds like a kind of peaceful acceptance, which a lot of us, when we're running around like headless chickens doing our tasks, are like, we often get caught up in life, don't we? And it's like kind of hard to sometimes remember that these things aren't necessarily good and bad. Like you said, I really like that point you made there.
Yeah, and I think that I feel like in our culture that where there's an element of conditioning. We do something, you do something bad as a child, bad, you are punished, right? You know, and then our childhood experiences are so formative in who we are as adults. Certainly, I feel like it anyway. And so, you know, if you are then responsible for punishing yourself for getting something wrong, right? Then it's
Mm.
the same pattern. And so it's just this kind of sea change, and you're taking it 180 and say no, actually that mistake I shouldn't be punished for, because I'm human, and it's just a really a nice way of looking at it. Yeah.
Mm. So you mentioned at the top about your daughter Molly, and when you first mentioned this to me, I was incredibly sorry to hear about the that you'd had to go through that, and your family
Yeah.
had to go through that. But I think if you're happy to talk about it, I think it'd be great to hear more about what you learned. Perhaps there's things in there that can help other people when
Mm,
they're experiencing grief. But yeah, if you're happy to talk to that,
of
that would
course.
be lovely.
Yeah. I mean, at the time we were all devastated with grief, and you know, it was really important for my healing that I went through that. All those different stages, and I struggled. I was drinking way too much, and I was soothing, and I couldn't deal with it for some months. But eventually, I found a purpose, not just me, my family, through the Molly Fund.
Mm.
And we set up a charity in her name, did loads of really cool and crazy stuff, organised loads of events, raised tens of thousands of euros, helped loads of children, and that was incredibly beautiful and cathartic. Just that we could see that her loss wasn't in vain, in that way that through her memory we were helping lots of other children like her, and are still doing it today. In fact, I went to visit a company in the UK who built this giant sonic device called the Molly Bear, which we're hopefully donated to Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. And so, it's been 8 years since she died, but her legacy lives on in that respect, and I'm incredibly proud of that. Um, you know, just moving on a little bit from that, that I think anyone who's lost a child will tell you it puts enormous pressure on a marriage. Mine was no different. My marriage then broke down, and I ended up divorcing. But over the years, and kind of coming away from my wife, ex-wife, and seeing more about learning more about who I was, I came to realize that, and I find this quite hard to say, that in some respects, the loss of Molly helped to set me free. And there is this adage, which is that what if the worst thing that ever happened to you was the best thing that's ever happened to you? And losing Molly was the worst thing that's ever happened to me. But also, it's one of the best things that's ever happened to me, because it taught me so much. It gave me so much strength, and it brought me to this place I am in my life now. And I think, for example, about my coaching, and when I was introducing myself to the coaching community, and I I I, I put a fair amount in there about her, and she has been a memory. And I'm looking at a picture of her now. She has been instrumental in actually for because I want to make her proud. I want to do things in her memory, but she was so incredibly brave. She didn't know what was happening, and she was, especially when she was younger, she was in so much pain, and she was just always so brave. And we never knew whether she'd walk or not. She walked, and yeah, she was just she was an inspiration. And 8+ years on, you know, I'm honoured to say that she's inspiring me now.
Mm.
So that's in a nutshell to answer your question.
No, thanks. And you've got an amazing resilience or strength from, her passing. And when you were talking there, I was reflecting, 'cause you did mention there were some darker times with alcohol, and I'm not surprised at all. And I
Mm.
wonder, how did you find the resilience, and this maybe help other people out there, to get to this good place that you're in now, when the other path is a lot darker? You could have gone down, I'm sure lots of people do unfortunately go down drink and drugs, and it's a really, and it's unsurprising when these terrible things happen in life. But I think maybe the lesson from you is from how did you get to such a strong place from that experience?
Yeah, and absolutely, I agree with you. And I think that it's if, as Gabor Mate would say, don't look at the addiction, look at what's behind the pain behind the addiction, right? And this was no different. I guess there was just a spark inside of me that I didn't want to go down that road. That it wasn't right for me. I have two beautiful children, and um, you know that I was worth something, and I didn't want to give in to that. And I think what really, really, really helped was when I had therapy, and the first time I had a therapeutic breakthrough with this kind of huge self-realization. That really, really helped because that, as I think I mentioned earlier, that gave me more self-esteem than I ever had. And I think that coupled with the spark that was in me already, plus wanting to be a great father for George and Ellen, plus wanting to Molly Proud. I think all of those things, trumped the darkness. And I got super fit, and I went and did the ETAP, which is a mountain stage of the Tour de France. And so I was like in great condition, and that was a big thing for me as well. Um, staying really, really fit helped. And then I just got into nutrition, and started eating incredibly well, and that helped massively, and I still am now. And so I think there was really a combination of those things. But if I had to narrow it down, I would say that, or say what was the most impactful of all of those things. I would say that there was just something inside me, a voice that I listened to, that said, "There's another way. There's something else. You're meant for more than this." And by the way, I believe everybody has that voice. It's just whether to what extent perhaps we choose to listen to it. And that's my reflection. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, and it sounded like you had incredible discipline, really, to listen to that voice and take the steps that go through a process to get to where you knew you could get to.
Yeah, I think perhaps, yeah, there was discipline, but it was more, again, just like an instinct. And I
Mm.
I didn't know, 5, 6, 7 years hence that this is where I'd be, but I knew that instinctually I wanted something else. And so, I just kept moving.
Mm.
That was it really. Just kept making progress. And
Literally and metaphorically.
exactly, just making progress, whatever it may be, and any progress is perfect, right? And it doesn't have to be much, and it just has to be a little bit, you know, and it's this,
Like that make the bed idea, isn't it? Have
what's
you
that?
read that one?
No.
Kind of make the bed idea.
Mm,
I think it's a military guy who wrote a book about like just in the morning, make your bed. It's that kind of
mm, mm.
action of doing something gives you that self-confidence and gets you onto the next thing, I think.
Absolutely, I've heard it. The way I like to kind of frame it is, I think it was, what's his name, Richard Brailsford, the guy who ran British Cycling, and he talks about the aggregation of marginal gain, right? And it's beautiful, and you can apply it to everything in life. If you don't have to do one big thing, you don't have to quit your job, or you don't have to leave your partner or whatever. They're big things, but what I'm saying is that if you make lots of tiny changes, that equals a big change. But it's just doing, this is kind of what I was
Mm.
was referring to. It's just doing small bits, and then if you add them all together, then it becomes something meaningful. And so just making progress, even if it feels really, really tiny. And precisely to your point, just making your bed, for example, may seem like nothing, but it's not. And then that perhaps will lead to another good habit, and so on and so on. And then it just becomes a kind of a virtuous circle. And the next thing you know, you're on a podcast speaking to Nat Baldwin.
Could be you. Yeah, no, exactly. I think I totally agree with that. And I feel it myself, even over the past few months, even as a microcosm, if I get into good habits and do for me, kind of do my journaling and try and do bits and pieces of fitness, and it's a kind of upward spiral, and then it's all like kind of gets better and better. And it's the same the other way around. If I drop off these things and start going back into old habits and doom scrolling and all of that. And it's a total
Mm,
cliche, but just feel pretty rubbish, and then everything goes the other way. So, yes, I definitely agree with what you said there. I had a question about your experience there with Molly, with the grief, with the journey you've been on, and how that how that fitted in with your job and your career, and what the interaction there was like. Because from an external perspective, what I see a lot of is a lot of support from companies to try and help people through these situations, and it tends to take a certain form of like supporting charity events and things like that, and understanding it's part of people. But yes, if you could speak to that, I'd be really interested.
yeah. I mean, it was so the company I was working for all the time were incredibly supportive, and I can't thank my boss and his boss enough. They were amazing. I Yeah, I just it's difficult to kind of to say, I suppose, because after it was 4 or 5, no, 5 or 6 weeks after, and I went back to work, and because I felt like I should, but I wasn't there. I wasn't, and then I ended up taking more time off. And actually, what happened after I took more time off is that I was put on the naughty list, um, and that created plenty of professional challenges for me in that type of environment. My boss moved on. So that just added to the stress, honestly. And it was a good few years before I managed to extricate myself or had the energy to kind of move on and go somewhere else. So it was honestly really, really hard. And I think the support came from individuals, and the community that we built, of the friends that we had here, and they were amazing. And I've been reflecting on it recently, actually, and it was just humbling to see how everybody came together to support us. After that. So yeah. So I don't know whether I've answered your question or not, but professionally, it was more tough, because I think the expectations of what I was able to give vis-a-vis what I did give, they were not
Mm.
commensurate. They weren't the same thing. And I'd been on the promotion radar the year before, and then I'll be honest, and this will be a surprise to anybody who listens to this who I used to work with, but it wasn't top of my priority list anymore. It created, as I mentioned, some challenges.
I think that makes sense because, I mean, I think brutally it's like business is business, isn't it? And there's a job to be done. And, and that's understandable from, I guess, from their perspective, is that they need to get on with things. And as a sort of, I'd imagine in these situations, I'm sort of slightly guessing here, but there's a period of time where they're kind of, right, you've got that time. But then beyond that, there's sort of a slightly binary expectation that you should just be back to who you were. And in reality,
Yeah,
you're a completely different person.
totally. You're 100% right. And I absolutely agree with what you said, which is that at the end of the day, my managers who were very senior in the business had a job to do. And, as devastating as what happened to me was, and they acknowledged that as humans, it still didn't mean that they didn't have that job to do. And, so I can't kind of, I have no animosity or anything towards them. I absolutely recognize that. And I think it's totally and utterly fair. But then again, when I look back on that and talking through with you now, it's like, well, you know, I couldn't find any meaning in that, personally. And the meaning that I was getting from life then was really all to do with the charity work, which is raising money for the Molly Fund, spending the money we raised, raising awareness for the charities that we were supporting. And that was the meaning and the purpose. And I suppose that was, goes to what I was talking about, which is the shift, the click, the change that happens, was even more pronounced then than it ever had been, because I know from day one it wasn't for me. But fast forward 20 odd years, I'm still there. But then that whole, the thinking was accelerated. Yeah, just to go right, but because of that loss, because I needed to find meaning and purpose in it, and it took me years to realize that, that, or I think to appreciate that, where I need or would like to find that is through, what we've been talking about, which is purpose and service, and through what I do professionally.
Really interesting. You use that word realize, and I think that is the first step with any of these sort of inverted commas journeys. I've built this model, sort of starts called React, and it starts off with the first three are realization, then evaluation, then sort of take action. But I think when you were speaking there, my question was going to be around, in that time period back then, like how much of a realization was there, or self-awareness, that this had changed in you, that you were focused more on the charity, on how big an event this was in your life, versus just thinking, I can just keep going here, I can keep doing what I had been doing.
I mean, speaking frankly, I don't think that there was that realization there in as many words, i.e., I knew that I needed to find something of meaning. I was just, pushing back on the existence that I created for myself. And it's only when I look back now and reflect on that do I realize that that is what it was. But at the time, I didn't know, and it was really confusing. And that also probably led to drinking more, and you're not really understanding what was happening. But that was the kind of the genesis of it all. I think certainly in this period of my life was that I just couldn't do it the same way anymore. And so I left the company that I had been working for, and then went to work in private equity, and spent a couple of years there, and approached it with, when I first got through the door, with such gusto, and really super driven. And then after a while, I was just giving so much and wasn't getting anything back. And then that just dissipates a bit, and you come to a level where you just do the job. And then moved on and did that again. And there was this, I could see the pattern, right? That if I stay in finance, because I have to earn money to support my family, then that's going to be the pattern. That, I'm going to go somewhere, give it everything, realize that there's nothing there of meaning, and then just not have the motivation to do it anymore. And then, because I could, you very kindly kind of mentioned this at the beginning, that, or whether we were on air or not, I don't know, but that I could go walk into a job in finance, and it's true, but I just kind of, I don't want this pattern to keep repeating itself, because at
Mm.
some point and we all make mistakes. And I say to my kids, like, I make mistakes every day. We all make mistakes every day. Let's just accept the fact we make mistakes, accept them, be compassionate with yourself, move on. But there needs to come a point where you keep making the same mistake, and then you go, no, actually, I'm not going to make that mistake anymore. And I suppose that everything that we've been talking about here, it's like, right, okay, well, I've got this great opportunity, and I don't want to keep making that mistake, which feels like a mistake to me, because the company doesn't get the best out of me, and I'm not approaching it giving 100% of who I am, and and then everything that is done outside of work to kind of compensate for that isn't kind of healthy and aligned with my values either. And so yeah, so I think that it's definitely that, really, just like finally learning.
Yeah. When you say that, I'm just reflecting on the fact that there's also, like, when we're talking about rights, wrongs, mistakes, and all these things, and an acceptance that they aren't in reality, good or bad, or mistakes or whatever, and also the fact that there is a time and a place for everything, right? So, and that's part. I think that's an interesting thing when I'm speaking to people in this midlife, mid-career phase of their life. It's like the beginning of your career served a purpose. You probably found it challenging, rewarding, financially it was rewarding, etc., etc. So it doesn't mean that when you get to midlife and you potentially think you want to do something else, that's a failing, right?
Mm,
That's just part of the journey, the next bit. Also, it might be that, quite frankly, you're just happy where you are, but you think you might need to make a few kind of alterations to things, that be a bit more intentional about how you spend your time, but in a narrow way within the kind of current role that you're in.
no,
I'm,
totally.
I'm I'm wondering what advice you would give to listeners who were like in a similar situation to you, maybe a couple of years ago when you were contemplating making a change.
Mm. I think the being sure of the what's important to you, I think is knowing what's important to you, I think, is absolutely vital. And then getting support, and then taking action. You know, I one of the biggest challenges that I've had is risks. I alluded to it earlier, but I've never taken risks in my life, and I'm sure it's some childhood thing. It doesn't really matter why, but and so because of that, I wasn't putting myself out there. I wasn't willing or able to be a beginner at anything, and so that was my biggest challenge, was overcoming that, to allow myself to be crap at something, which really, when I first started coaching, that was how it was. So I think if you want to take action, just make it happen, make a decision, make it happen. Acknowledge the fact that you're not going to be good at what you're doing if it's something completely different, and just be compassionate with yourself. I mean, lots of other stuff for me. Much better if I set targets myself, just stay present, as much as possible, whether that's through meditation or just being mindful. Setting the daily intention, super helpful, and having a plan, I suppose, as well. But at the same time, having some flex to that plan. It's just only when on the journey, perhaps things may present themselves which I hadn't thought about in my example on my own journey. So yeah, I think I just want to go back to one thing you said, which is that to recognize for people who are in this position when they're, in their midlife and they've taken their career ladder and they've climbed it and then they've got to the top of it and realized that they've leaned it against the wrong wall. Well, you know, that's to be celebrated because there is gold there, right? All of that experience that that person had, getting to that place at the top of their ladder, and then having that realization, and then in some way wanting to share that and wanting to perhaps help others if that's the realization that they've had, or even not, to just do something different with it. It's just so incredibly powerful. I don't think, I in my own experience, I wouldn't and haven't looked at that as a failure or a mistake. I've looked at it as just something that is incredibly powerful experience for me to bring to whatever I do going forward. Yeah.
Totally. And just understand that in a practical sense, that there's just so many soft skills that we all develop, and we tend to focus on the kind of sector or industry or function that we serve, and not so much on the soft skill sets that actually usually set us apart and make us successful. That's really what we're that's getting us to where we have got to in our careers. And a lot of it is completely transferable. And it just takes, like you say, a bit of sitting down, a bit of realization, a bit of evaluation. Who do you want to be? What do you want to be doing? And like you say, making a plan, taking action towards that. It's just, there really is a bit of a process there. It can feel, you speak to people who've been in an industry or a job for 20 years and they feel stuck. They think, I can't move on. What would I do? Being a teacher for however 20 years, what else could I do? Well, actually, any number of things, that you've got passion about,
Completely.
that you have, transferable skill sets in.
Couldn't agree more. I absolutely think that, and it's actually sometimes only when people's kind of stop and take stock of what they've done, what they've achieved, and what skills they have learned, they'll realize just how transferable they are. And I think that it's worth acknowledging that at the end of the day, it's all about. I mean, for me, it's all about our connection to people, right? And if you can build connections to people, you don't need you don't need to be that technical or anything like that. In my opinion, just need to be able to connect with people, and that is also gold, I think.
Yeah, great. I always ask this question around freedom and what that means to you, how you personally define freedom based on your experiences. So, what are your views on that?
So, I mean, that's evolved over time. It used to be one thing, and that was freedom was financial independence. Now it's financial independence is one of them, but also it's um, freedom of thought. To be able to think, freely, and also the freedom of authenticity, the freedom of connection to who I really am. And I think of the three things that I've mentioned, that is absolutely the top priority for me. Is feeling, if I feel connected to who I am, then that creates, a freedom that, without being too trite, money can't buy. I really believe that.
That's really nice. I love that. Okay, I haven't actually spoken to you about this yet, but the Freedom Challenge.
Mm,
Have you a challenge for
mm.
me and our listeners that I will attempt to do before the next episode, and I'll fill people in on how I've got on?
Okay. Yes, I did. Yes, I did. So the study of eco psychology is a big thing for me. And eco psychology is how nature impacts your well-being. And there's a chap called Matthew White who works at the University of Exeter, and him and his team did this huge study, 20 plus thousand people, on going into nature and how that influences or impacts your mental health and your well-being. And what they found is that, and there is a cut-off. What they found is if you spend 2 hours or more a week in nature, that it has a meaningful effect on your general well-being, your happiness, it reduces anxiety, feelings of depression, and so on. And so my challenge to you is for the next week to, if you can do it on a daily basis, go and spend 20 minutes a day, which obviously makes slightly more than 2 hours, but spend a minimum of 2 hours in nature in that week, and then see how it makes you feel. Because just anecdotally, this morning my son had a nightmare last night, terrible night's sleep. I felt a bit grotty, but I went out really early this morning for a walk in the forest, and I got into the forest within 2 minutes. I was just, I just felt alive and connected, and it's incredible what nature can do. So my freedom challenge is that to you now.
Thank you very much. I love that one, very close to my heart. And I think what I'll do is report back on actually use this word intentional about the effect, and try and actually focus on the effect, and kind of be grateful for being out there. Sometimes I'll tend to sort of stick the headphones in and walk the dog on autopilot type thing, but actually
Mm,
probably enjoy it most when I go out and just actually listen to the birds, and sort of stop and smell the roses, or stop and smell the pine needles.
100%. And I absolutely advocate going out without headphones on. And I always go, and I'm sure your listeners may laugh, but I pretty much always go and hug a tree, and just connecting to the forest, the mycorrhizal, is that how you say it? The entangled life, the wood wide web. The forest is all connected. It's got this beautiful energy, and always connect and give thanks. And sometimes the forest just pings into my head. So yeah, it's a beautiful thing, which is a huge part of my life. And if I was saying to anyone, how can you move the needle quickly, just with your overall well-being, that would be pretty high on the list.
That's brilliant. And thanks very much for giving me the clickbait title now, from banker to tree hugger. So
Oh, brilliant! Yeah. Oh, brilliant!
that
Yes.
that be getting us lots of views. Stuart, that's been amazing, really insightful, and to be honest, I think we've actually just got so much in common. So it's great to meet people who have had similar journeys. We've got things in common, we've got things that are obviously differences, and it's just great to learn from someone such as yourself. And I think people will take loads away from that conversation. I'm hoping, I really do. So thank you again for coming on and sharing.
No, so it's my absolute pleasure, and thank you for everything you do. And it's been great to connect with you, and I'm so pleased that we did. So yeah, all the best with this. Great questions, now, and thank you for being so present, and for honouring me and my journey. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Stuart.